Hi,
Hey,
I'm
can I?
agency consultant Karl Sakas, and this is Agency Office Hours for September 2020, sponsored by Sakas and Company. We'll be answering questions from agency owners and leaders all over the world about how to grow your agency more profitably. If you'd like me to answer a question in a future office hours, feel free to sign up, and when you sign up free of charge, you can put in your question. If I choose your question to answer with the group, I'll let you know ahead of time, and you'll get some free consulting. All right. Well, first up today is Raymond in Lithuania. A question about pricing. As a reminder, everyone, we are recording, so don't share anything you don't want to be public. Raymond, welcome. You are up.
Thank you, Carl. So I had a question to Carl about pricing best practices and pricing as well as quote preparation, I suppose. These are the two areas that I'm looking for wisdom at this point. My more specific question would be like this: there are essentially two ways to prepare quotes for inquiries, and one would be kind of this time and material principle, where you try to think of what are the needs of the project or of the client that
Uh-huh.
you will need, and then you list all of these things, and you try to estimate to the best of your ability. Usually, if you estimate, if you're not a specialist, your estimates tend to be off. So then, if you give the estimate to the team to estimate, then it obviously takes way more time
Yes.
than it would do if there was just one person. But usually, since it revolves around maybe 3 or 4 competencies, then obviously one individual cannot have all of them.
Right.
Yeah, and then the other approach would be to just package everything into standard packages, which kind of you're able to do maybe more precisely, because you can look at the certain data from the past, and you can like look at how much stuff kind of takes, and then
Yep.
you can put it into a package. The problem with the package is that oftentimes it doesn't allow enough of the flexibility. Oftentimes clients can get turned off. And I'm just wondering, what are the best practices in the agency world about how to maybe balance those two, or when to lean on one thing or the other, or anything else that you could share with us, I think would be beneficial.
Absolutely. Well, there are a few things going on there. First, there's a question about pricing model. And in addition to the two you mentioned, there's time and materials or hourly, there's milestone or deliverable based, and there's a third one, which is value-based pricing. Most agencies aren't quite ready to go to full value-based pricing, but that is a third option out there. I would recommend mastering hourly or milestone first. So there's that piece. So there are the three models, and there are pros and cons of each. On chat, I just shared a link to my article on the three models. There's also a question about choosing to do customized versus productized services, or a combo of both. Likewise, there are pros and cons to that as well. And if you're going to do custom work, there's a question of who's going to do the scoping. So I've shared some articles about that to help dig in. I think one of the questions would be, in your current work, what is the mix between custom versus productized for you, Raymond?
Mostly custom, I'd say.
Got it.
Well, there are certain things that are definite and they go into every project,
Mm,
but oftentimes these standard processes would make up a rather small part of the project if it's custom development. So you could maybe say that the standard falls anywhere between 10 to 15% of the total amount of work, and then everything
Yeah.
else is custom development.
And indeed, I've seen that at the past, as an agency employee, where at both of them we were doing mostly custom work, but we did have an estimate library. For instance, we assumed that if we were building a website, there would be a homepage. A standard homepage was this many hours for strategy and design and development, both front end development, back end development, that kind of thing. But then certain enhancements would make it more involved. If you're going to pursue the custom approach, custom rather than productized, as you noted, you need someone competent doing the scoping and figuring out the pricing, especially if you're going to do custom work on a milestone basis, where you're like, client, here's all the stuff you want, here's how much it'll cost. That's risky, of course, because you need to invest a lot of time trying to figure out what the scope is. If you're doing a binding price, if it's deliverable based, you want to get it right. The problem, of course, is that if you're doing that at the proposal stage, you may not know if you're actually going to get paid to do the work. And so that creates a bit of a disincentive to be super specific because it may not even happen. One option is to do custom work on an hourly basis. That's effectively a version of what agencies do when they do agile-based sprints. They're saying, here's generally the backlog of what you, the client, have said you want. We're going to keep prioritizing the backlog as we go. We're going to work, say, 2 weeks at a time. We'll do this, and we'll do this, and we'll keep going until the client is either happy or the client has run out of money. So that is an option. If you don't want to scope everything out up front, you could do hourly on a sprint basis, on an agile basis. You also could do a paid discovery engagement. That's where you do an initial engagement, no more than a few $1,000s, few €1,000, a few £1,000, designed to dig into what does the client actually need, what are their priorities, what's must have versus nice to have versus phase two, that kind of thing. And the idea is that because you're getting paid to do that analysis, you're going to be more in depth than if you were just doing a sales proposal. The other benefit around paid discovery is that it's sort of a mutual trial, right? You're deciding, do you want to work with them? They're deciding, do they want to work with you? And ultimately, sort out, is it a match? From what I've shared, which of those sound like it might be a good direction to explore next?
I would be really keen on getting the paid discovery, because that truly is something that we would, as an agency, if we are pressed to prepare a proposal, this is the type of in-depth work that actually needs to go into.
Yes.
And then if you're getting paid, then it makes the work much more enjoyable, so to say. The one problem, I think, is that oftentimes when you're asked to prepare a quote, you're not a single agency that's in the process. So then essentially it's like the client needs to pick an agency, kind of, that they think that they would be willing to go. And although I like the idea of paid discovery and think that, like you mentioned, there are benefits to both the agency and the client.
Yes.
If you're going to spend an X amount of money and you consider that an investment, and perhaps like buying some sort of an insurance policy on that investment is a good idea. For some reason,
can be a harder sell if the client has never worked with an agency before. Clients will sometimes have this idea, especially if they're less sophisticated. Oh, well, the agency knows what they're doing. They're an expert at this. They'll know exactly what to do, from the beginning. Why should we really have to, scope things out? On the other hand, if you've worked with a client who's worked with several agencies before, like they know the reality that you try to figure things out in advance, but there's only so much you can do. The idea of doing paid discovery is more realistic. But if the client hasn't been burned yet by working with another agency or doing something internally where things sort of blew up, they may be less predisposed to it. But I shared in chat an article on paid discovery, and there's a follow-up article there about looking at how to get started, and that you may find that helpful. Not every client is going to want to do paid discovery, and part of your decision then needs to be, do you want to work with them if they don't want to do it? Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. It is worth considering, though, if they're saying, it's you versus another agency that has done some sort of super in-depth proposal that may or may not be based in reality, but looks good. In that case, it's more of a conversation with the client about, well, how in-depth did you go? Like, do they have an in-depth picture, or are they just guessing? You can say our process is we want to understand what your situation is. We can't adequately do that during the sales process. But once you decide which agency is the right match, which agency you trust to do a good job, if we're that agency for you, we'll work together to figure that out. It's about framing it as a partnership. Not everyone's going to say yes, but then you have to decide, is that a match or not? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I am a fan of paid discovery. Like I said, I think it's a win-win. I think what an agency should aim is probably, and what would make it an easier sell is if an agency were able to develop something that, even in the case a client chooses not to pursue the project with you,
Yes.
then that they can take it to someone else and have it like a blueprint type of thing.
That is part of what makes paid discovery work. My belief is that paid discovery needs to be portable, in the sense that the client gets a deliverable. Maybe it's an audit, maybe it's an initial strategy, it's some sort of analysis. It's portable because they could take that deliverable to another agency and they could act on it. And that's part of what makes, if a client's like, well, wait, am I like paying you to create a proposal? I mean, in a sense you are, because you'll do paid discovery and then you'll follow up with a phase 2 proposal based on the initial work, based on what you've learned. But they're getting a portable artifact, a deliverable that they could take anywhere else. And part of your framing is, we're giving you something or you're buying something that you could take anywhere. We are so confident that you'll like working with us and you'll like the experience, that you'll want to keep working with us, but you're not required to. And so it basically lets them feel safe about the investment.
Okay, thank you.
You'd also had a question related to, is there a way to automate pricing? To an extent, you can automate it by building that estimate library. There are limits to how much you can do with that from a custom scoping perspective, but it's certainly a starting point. I know the software tool Parakeeto will take your harvest estimates or harvest time tracking info and turn it into projections about how long a future engagement will take. I did a demo of that recently with their founder, Marcel, and it was pretty impressive, even in an early stage version of things. So, some of it is using the data you've got to make projections. Thinking other related pieces, there's also that question of, do you want to do custom work or switch to productized? As I share in the article on custom versus productized services that I shared in chat, there are pros and cons to both. If you're doing productized services where you're like, pick from a menu and you get this and this and that's it, nothing beyond that, the advantage is that's easier to scope. I mean, in a sense, you're not doing a custom scope because they're picking, option A or B or C, or maybe, they're picking from a menu of things. And that's also potentially easier to implement because your team is, doing modular things all day long, potentially can get cheaper people from a sales perspective, from a fulfillment perspective. But as you noted, you're going to be saying no to more prospective clients because it's a productized thing. I run into that with executive coaching, where my executive coaching service is a one-on-one coaching service. And occasionally people are like, well, my business partner and I would both like to get coaching. Can we both get coached at the same time? And you know what? I've tried it over the years. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because people are individuals. And although, yeah, it's the same company, I end up in sort of a marriage counselor situation. So I've learned the hard way, executive coaching is productized. You get a monthly call and accountability and email support and this and that and other bonuses, but I can't customize it to be 2 clients and 1 coach. Agency owners have to choose. One person gets the coaching. And I do have other options like custom consulting projects where we can provide some of the benefits of coaching, but with 2 clients at once. But you have to decide philosophically what's right for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And the follow-up article should come in handy. And I also shared an article about pricing philosophy in general. Cool. Well, Raymond, thank you so much. I appreciate your joining today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Some other questions that we got in advance. I know, looking on some of the pieces there, Sean mentioned challenge around clients who want to do projects who don't seem to see value in retainers. Also, a question from Felipe in Brazil about team accountability, and Christina about clients who are indecisive. Let's see. So as I'm looking there, if I didn't mention your question and you're interested in asking a question, go ahead and share it in chat. We should have an opportunity to answer some additional questions. So if you've got a question, go ahead and share it on chat. And, I think we may be able to answer your question today. But, looking ahead, I think Sean is not on the line at the moment, but let's take a look at that question related to what do you do when a client doesn't want to sign a retainer? I hear this frequently. You've got a client at your agency that keeps coming back for ongoing work, but whenever you raise the idea of they're signing a retainer, suddenly they're not so interested. And that's certainly a frustrating situation, right? Because, assuming this is a client that you enjoy working with, that you want to keep helping, it's ultimately frustrating, right? You're ready to help them, you're committed to them, but for some reason they are not committing to you. So what do you do in that situation? You've got a client who needs your help, wants your help, keeps coming back, but doesn't want to commit. I would start by taking a look at why aren't they signing a retainer? Some client organizations might be concerned about making an ongoing monthly commitment for 12 months, 6 months, potentially longer, maybe shorter, although ideally don't do retainers for shorter than 6 months. Maybe they are reluctant to make a commitment. I mean, especially right now from a COVID perspective, people may not want to make a large ongoing commitment to spend money every month. And that's okay. It is worth framing in that case, there's a price premium for working on a month-to-month basis. If they sign a retainer, they may get some sort of a discount. And if they don't sign a retainer, that's okay. But there's, a larger per unit or per hour or what have you commitment. That's something to keep in mind. There may be other reasons why they don't want to commit. Maybe things internally at the client organization just tend to be shambolic. And they're like, well, we can't really commit to a certain amount every month because we don't know what we actually need to do. Now the ball is in your court. You have an opportunity to review their past work. And you might do your analysis and you might say, oh, well, based on our work with you, you've averaged between 12 hours and 27 hours every month. You're coming in on average around 19 hours a month. Based on that, we'd recommend doing a retainer for the equivalent of 15 hours a month, and then you can pay for overage at a lower rate. So, the point is they can feel like they're getting a good deal, but it's up to you to frame that to them, right? They're not going to guess. They're not necessarily going to be keeping track of exactly how many hours they're using and things like that. If you're listening live on chat, I just shared some articles about retainer pros and cons, helping you reposition yourself as a strategy-first agency, and looking in general the nature of the strategic work you're doing. If you're looking to frame options, you've got my reason, options, choose technique around the idea of cite a reason, hey, we'd love to keep working with you, If you're not on a retainer, we have to deprioritize your scheduling. But if you'd like priority scheduling, we've got some options for you. Option one might be a really big retainer, and you can, say yes to almost everything they do because it fits the retainer, and you're good to go. Maybe option two is a smaller retainer that gives them some sort of priority rate for that work, and then they can add on more. And maybe the third option is ultimately to continue working on an ad hoc basis, but as they work on an ad hoc basis, the priority and the scheduling is going to be lower, and it's going to be at a higher rate, all things considered. And then let them choose, whether they pick the big retainer with the good pricing and turnaround, the smaller retainer with somewhat higher pricing, or the one-off kind of situation where they're not on a retainer. Either way, your agency is benefiting because they're picking one of the options you've offered, and then you let them choose. And importantly, they're choosing from your list of options. So I keep that in mind. Some clients may never want to commit to a retainer. And I don't recommend pursuing a retainer if they're a new client and you've got some red flags, but you need the money, right? And you feel like, well, I'm not really excited about working with them, but I need the money, and so I guess we better do it. In that case, if you're taking a red flag client because ultimately, feel like you need the money, but you don't really want to keep working with them, in that case, my recommendation would be don't put them on a retainer. Or if you do, make sure it's a shorter retainer than you want. Why is that? Well, you don't want to lock yourself in working forever with a client who is terrible. And that also helps create some incentive for you to keep selling. So that's what I'd recommend keeping in mind from that perspective. For the audience, this is a question for everyone. Do you have any questions about that, about getting clients to sign retainers? If so, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. And of course, if things are going super smoothly with retainers, then I guess you are good to go. All right. Well, if you have questions on that, feel free to raise your hand or share in chat. All right. So we have a question related to well, actually, wait a minute. Let's do a poll. I have been getting questions from agencies about, in general, how do you work less and earn more? And I'm actually looking at creating something new, which is to create a 6-week boot camp based on the work less, earn more approach, which will also be my third book, Work Less, Earn More, How to Escape the Daily Grind of Agency Ownership. If that's something you might be interested in, the idea of doing a boot camp, I'd love to get your feedback through the poll. Again, the idea is a six weeks of live calls. There'd be homework in between calls that you'd work on, maybe 2 or 3 hours a week, sometimes a little bit more. The idea would be generally a good match if you have at least 5 people at your agency, since you'll be able to delegate. If you don't have anyone to delegate to, it'll be a bit harder. So that'll be helpful. And then it would start in January, and then by mid-February, you'll have a 90-day custom growth plan to help you make yourself increasingly optional at your agency. If that's something you're interested in or not, I'd love your vote in the poll. All right. Well, and I see a few new people have joined. Thanks so much for coming in. Let's see. Carol, hello. Pat, Rebecca, JR, Justin, thank you for joining. All right. And if you'd like more one-on-one help, in-depth, I have executive coaching for that. And if you're looking for more bite-sized support, can provide that through my new one-off bite-sized consulting calls. Those have been pretty popular, and I've actually just raised prices for those. So if you're interested, I'd recommend checking those out. They are first come, first served. All right. I think we're going to have at least one spot for an additional live question today. So if you're interested, go ahead and share in chat what your question is, and I may bring you in live to join, and we'll answer your question free of charge live on video. All right, so next up, I got a question from Felipe in Brazil. One of his question was, how does he ensure that his agency is operating as a meritocracy? That is, where he's being fair to various people on the team. So there are a few pieces going on there. One is just the commitment to operate as a meritocracy, that you want to be fair. That includes thinking about, when are you setting a precedent? Are you potentially setting a precedent with your team that, once you do it for one person, then you have to do it for everyone. You imagine, when you're in elementary school and primary school, and, the teacher would be like, if we do that for you, we'll have to do it for everyone. They're right. And especially for you as an agency leader, once you do something for one employee, one team member, you're creating a precedent of needing to do that for everyone, which, can be a risky situation, right? You give one person a special exemption on time off, and then everyone expects that. And also that team member might expect it every time rather than just a one-time situation. But in general, if the goal is to be fair, that includes taking some time to think before you make decisions that have precedence. That includes saying, maybe someone asks for something, you're like, hey, that sounds interesting. Let me reflect on that. I'll get back to you tomorrow. Or, if it's not as urgent, let me reflect on that. Could you check with me next week, right? Put the ball in their court. The onus is on them to follow up with you to make it happen, right? You don't need to take that responsibility on. A former boss referred to that as taking on other people's monkeys, the idea of, the monkey on your back. If someone asks for something that really is more driven by what they need, you can ask them to own following up on it. That makes things easier for you. All right. If you haven't voted in the poll yet, please vote in the poll. I'd love your market research feedback. Thank you. In terms of meritocracy and accountability, some other pieces include making clear what people need to do to get promoted. When your agency started out, and if you're early in your agency's life now, you may be in this situation yourself, where, it's not always clear what the path is. How do people move forward? How do people move up? You don't know, right? Because you're just making things up right now. And, once you get past, say, 10 people at your agency, you'll want to formalize that. And if you're much larger than that, if you're 20 people, 30 people, 50 or 100 people, and you haven't laid out what the promotion paths are, it is time to do it now. I mean, it's past time, but it's time to do it. For instance, I did a culture survey of a client in the US who was having a retention problem with employees where people were quitting. And the way the owner put it, it's like, if more people quit, I'm going to be in big trouble, but I don't know why they're leaving. So through my culture module, I did an anonymous culture survey of members of his team. And what I found, well, I found a few things, but one of the things I found was that people were confident about the agency's future, but they weren't as confident about their own future within the agency. And what we realized as I was collaborating with the owner was that people figured the agency was going to do well, but they weren't sure where they fit in and how they were part of the whole process. Obviously, that's a problem, right? If people see the agency doing well, but they don't know where they fit in, eventually they're going to look for a new job. So one of the things we did was created promotion paths. What are the different layers within the agency? What do you need to do to move forward? We also had a couple people who were interested in getting promoted to director. There were 2 people who were, potential internal hires after the original director left. My advice for the owner was they still need to compete for it. They need to demonstrate that they're interested. So my advice was assign them to read my book, Made to Lead, the pocket guide to managing marketing and creative teams. And I said, have them come back to you with a book report, basically. Say, I read the book. Here's what stood out to me. Here's what I see as my strengths and weaknesses as a future manager. And see, did they invest the time? Are they demonstrating that they care about making sure this is a fit? also, are they demonstrating that they understand that becoming a manager, or in this case, a director, isn't just about the nice title and the nice raise? Like, it's hard work. As I share in Made to Lead, I mean, ultimately, if you're leading, it's easy to be a bad boss. It's really hard to be a good boss, right? It's a challenging situation. I'm curious, does anyone else have any questions about creating a meritocracy at your agency? If so, go ahead and share on chat, or you can take yourself off mute and share out loud. And I just shared some additional notes in chat there about building a performance improvement plan, also some pieces around owner versus employee mindset. Anything that anyone would add, or any follow-up questions on that?
I'm just curious about the idea of the meritocracy. Is it from the Ray Dalio's book Principles?
So I don't have the follow-up notes from Felipe on what had informed his question. So I'm not 100% sure. Is there anything you'd like to add about that from Ray Dalio's book?
Not necessarily. Just I'm curious about the idea because it seemed to work for Ray Dalio and valuable insights. However, I am not quite sure how it's not a straightforward path to implement a meritocracy in an agency world.
The related piece is that, of course, he was running, a hedge fund, and sort of regardless of how you feel about hedge funds, if you are managing a hedge fund, your returns are pretty obvious. I mean, obviously, there's some opacity in valuation of assets and things like that, but ultimately, you're sorting out what was the return, and the company has a strong need to calculate the return because that's in part how they charge fees to their clients. So in that case, it's very clear. Now, for agencies, what is the sort of incontrovertible thing that usually would be billable hours? Of course, different people are going to have billable goals. If you've got a subject matter expert and they're working 40 hours a week, they could be billing 75, 80, maybe 85% of those hours. If you've got an account manager or a project manager, they're probably billing 20 hours a week. If you've got someone doing sales or operations, they probably are billing nothing, depending on how you have the role split up. So billable hours works for your more billable people, but you could also look at, say, on project management, looking at gross margins for projects. You could look on account management about client retention, client satisfaction, things like that. So there are some things you can look at, but it's not quite as simple as what was the return relative to the relevant benchmark or relevant index. Frank, I saw you asked, or you mentioned, how do you create and enforce the KPIs that create that culture? That important question. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I talk. It's easier. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. And actually, sorry, it looks like Ricardo. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense. And obviously you want to create a culture and you're going to create a workplace where people feel like their good work is being rewarded. But our attempts in the past at creating that kind of environment always go to the end question of how are you measuring that merit, right?
Yeah.
Is it just by output, as I think you were going with your previous examples? Because, for example, in our case, we lead a team of developers, and it feels kind of odd if you're just going to do it based on hours worked or lines of code produced or like that raw output, when there's a variety of projects with variety of like difficulty levels amongst those projects. So I think that the hard thing for us there isn't exactly if that concept makes sense or not, or even how we would implement it from a reward standpoint. I think it is setting and then measuring constantly whatever KPIs would contribute to, setting up that kind of merit-based career advancement or whatever you want to call it.
Yes, and those will vary within each team. For a development environment in particular, I just shared an article in chat It's a classic Fast Company article from circa 1996. And the article is called "They Write the Right Stuff," looking at the space program in the US, specifically the team or the teams that write software to run at the time the space shuttle, and the teams that provide quality assurance on the development work that the software development team created. And one of the things they talk about was that they effectively were able to create software that was virtually error-free. And, you know, it was a life or death situation. They noted that the last 3 versions of the software running the space shuttle each had 420,000 lines of code, and they had 1 error each.
Yeah, that's
one
impressive.
error out of
That's a good
400.
track record.
Yeah. And one of the things they talked about, you know, how do you do that, right? I mean, that sounds nice, right? You know, one of the things that they did to make that happen was to basically pit the development team against the QA team, and vice versa. So what they did was they would have the development team create the software. Then the QA team would do their best to find every bug possible. And so the QA team was working to find the bugs, but it eventually created a virtuous cycle because the development team didn't like the QA team finding bugs, and so they were working harder up front to keep the bugs from going in the first place. Now, in this case, it helped that it was literally, with the space shuttle software, you know, software behind the space shuttle, literally a life or death situation, as, you know, unfortunately we've seen, you know, in reality. And so they had a strong mission, a strong sense of mission. Like, if they made an error, someone might die. In our work, that's usually not the case. I had a former boss who liked to say, well, he liked to say a number of things, but one of the things he liked to say was, it's only marketing, no one's going to die. For the most part, that's true. I guess it depends on what you're marketing. But I think that raises, you know, when there's a shared mission, it's easier for people to focus on making the right choices and wanting to do a good job. The KPIs, the key performance indicators, are going to vary by person, but it is worth considering, you know, what is pulling everyone together. And it's possible that depending on what your agency focuses on, and this is, you know, for everyone, you may need to find a mission that goes beyond the specifics of what your client do. For instance, you know, I work with several agencies who focus on e-commerce marketing. Depending on which aspects you do within e-commerce, it is worth considering that basically, you know, what are you helping your clients do? You're helping them sell more stuff. Depending on what they're selling, that may be making the world better, and it may not, or maybe it's mixed or it's neutral. So in that case, you might need to find a mission that's more around doing a good job, or more around building, you know, team camaraderie or things like that. But that's where I'd start from. So thank you for clarifying on that. Anything you'd add, Ricardo?
No, I think that makes sense, and I think it's valid across even other areas, right? Like even the billable hours, you don't want to increase them for the sake of increasing them. It
Yes.
always needs to be tied up to a larger company goal, rather than just pitting individuals against each other in a very like competitive sort of environment that might not be aligned with those values and with a common interest.
Exactly. And that raises a related point, which is often agency owners are like, Karl, what's one KPI I can have for everything? If you were to have just one KPI, it would be look at your revenue per full-time equivalent. That is, take your annual services revenue divided by your full-time equivalents. That'll be all of your full-time employees, prorated for part-time people, prorated for key ongoing contractors. And that services revenue, you subtract out pass-throughs, like printing fees, media buying, things like that. So you've got services revenue for the year divided by your full-time equivalent, and that'll give you your services, your revenue per FTE. The advantage of that is you can use that as a benchmark to measure your overall health. If you're a generalist agency, ideally that is at least $150,000 US per year, or converted to your relevant currency. And if you're a specialist, that would ideally be at least $200,000 per year. So for instance, if you do the numbers and it's, you're a generalist and it's 100,000 a year, and you've got 10 people, that's 50,000 times 10. If we can close that gap, you're adding $500,000 a year in new revenue with your existing team. Almost all of that's going to be profits, because that's, you're not having to hire new people. You may at some point. But imagine, adding, say, all in $300,000 in net profits if you can close that gap. So if there's one KPI, it's revenue per FTE. But if you're looking at a per person basis, it's tough to narrow it down to just one, right? It's not just billables, but also quality. For instance, you have to keep reopening the tickets if you're using a ticketing system, to say the PM or the account manager assigns it, a subject matter expert creates it, they kick it back. But then the PM or the AM is like, nope, you didn't do it right. And you have to reopen it, they fix it, and it comes back. That is a good way, ticket reopen rate or equivalent based on your project management system to help you sort that out. That can come in handy. But, it's tough to narrow it down to just one. And there's a catch. I worked with an agency earlier this year where they had narrowed it down to, instead of team-based KPIs, it was all individual KPIs. And they ran into I think unexpected for them, I guess expected for me. I wasn't working with them when they set the KPIs, but people ended up focusing exclusively on their own KPIs, and they weren't helping other people on the team because they were just all about their own KPI. So pros and cons, it's worth thinking that through, beforehand rather than, just diving in. All right, so, we've talked about a couple situations. We've talked about, what do you do when, or, how do you improve your approach to pricing? We also talked about clients who don't want to sign retainers, who would be a fit otherwise. We talked a bit about creating meritocracy, helping hold your team accountable. If you don't have it already, I'd recommend checking out my book, Made to Lead, since that gives you, step-by-step advice to help you improve how you handle things. If you have read it, feel free to chime in and chat about what stood out from the book. And if not, I just shared the Kindle edition link. There's also a paperback version. Most people read it in 20 or 30 minutes and then refer back to it, as they go, as they lead people. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. I'll do a lightning round on Christina's question about clients who are indecisive. If you'd like to be considered for a live question, go ahead and share on chat, and I'll pick out of any of the options, time permitting, to answer your question. So the question that Christina in Chicago shared was, what do you do about clients who are indecisive, where, the client can't make up their mind, they are just generally indecisive? I would start, if you've got an indecisive client, I would start by looking at, why are they indecisive? Is that about them individually? Is that about the culture of their organization? Or is there something else going on? What is the why behind it? I mentioned the reason options choose technique. Once you understand what they want, you can use reason options choose to lay out options for them. So that can help. Another piece is, once you know what they want, professionally and personally, you can find options that work for them. You can also look for ways to make them the hero. If we think about the hero's journey concept from Joseph Campbell, and certainly in StoryBrand, they've adopted that. To expand on that, I just shared a link there about making your client the hero. If you can position your client as the hero, like making a decision is going to help them succeed and help them meet their goals, well, why wouldn't they make the decision? They're helping out. It's also worth digging into, why aren't they deciding? For instance, at one point as an agency project manager, I inherited a client who maybe wasn't indecisive, but I'd heard she was kind of squirrely, right? She would be slow to make decisions, and generally was a frustrating situation when it came to getting sign-offs. I decided as a new project manager, I would try to reboot the relationship and see if I could save things. I didn't know if I could do it, but I figured I'd try. And so I reached out to the contact, the client, and introduced myself and suggested doing a call to get to know each other, get up to speed on things. And I'd heard that she would take forever to sign off. I was thinking, maybe she was indecisive. one of the questions I asked her was, where does this particular work fit in your list of priorities? And she laughed. She said, this is like number 9 on my list. Oh, well, that explained it. It's not that she was indecisive or that she didn't care. It just wasn't that important. So relative to her list of priorities, this just wasn't number 1 on her list. It wasn't 2 through, it was number 9. I mean, she was sort of joking, but she was about right. You know, number 9 on the list. So the other piece, so what did I do? Well, once I learned that this was number 9 on our list, I realized, or speaking with her, she said she needed an update for her quarterly board meeting. So as long as she had an update for the board meeting about progress for the latest round of things, she was good to go. Great. I scheduled things to make sure that we had our quarterly update. She was ready to go. She looked good to the board. My team wasn't as frustrated with, you know, why were things so delayed. And, you know, I wasn't frustrated working with her either, because we had that heart-to-heart conversation that made things, you know, a lot easier. All right. And you know, other reasons they might be indecisive. Some people just tend to be non-committal in general. One thing to consider would be help them understand why making a decision is in their interest. You know, maybe you've got a client where you keep running into content delays. You know, content delays aren't entirely your fault, but, you know, you're the expert on getting the work done. You know, if a client is having, you know, trying to struggle with things, lay out the options. Use reason, options, choose. Lay out what you need them to do, and then help them understand. And also, they need to understand the implications. You know, if they aren't making a decision, you know, what's going to happen if they don't decide. All right. Well, I am sharing on chat 2 additional resources as we wrap up today. One, if today was helpful, register for the next office hours. The next one will be on October 13th. You can register for any date in 2020, and I'll be soon setting things up to join on how to sign up for 2021. It's the second Tuesday of every month in this time slot, free of charge. If you're interested in asking a question, get a hot seat Q&A, feel free to ask your question when you sign up, and I'll let you know beforehand if I picked your question. And also, if you aren't getting my email newsletter yet, I know most of the people on the call are. I recognize most of the names. You know, as a preview, tomorrow's newsletter looks at new client discounts. If you've ever been tempted to give a new client or a first-time client discount, you're not alone. It's a bad idea. I mean, you know it's a bad idea, but, you know, what do you do? I'll share 4 reasons why new client discounts are a bad idea, and then I'll share 5 reasons or 5 things you can do instead of that new client discount to help you land the deal, but avoid setting a dangerous or risky precedent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining today. Appreciate your joining Agency Office Hours. I'm Karl Sakas, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks.
Thank you, Karl.